To finish off this Cobra Kai tutorial series, we're gonna simulate a bunch of glowing embers to fill out the atmosphere of our scene using CC Particle World. We'll composite it all together and finish this completely procedural project that you can use again and again. Let's take a look at those particles. And taking a look at the original, we can see what exactly that looks like. If I turn up the exposure compensation, not only are there all these embers that are glowing and floating, all the ash that's close to the camera up against the wall, but we're also getting some of this light spilling off of the flames that are supposedly in the scene down here around the edges of the screen. And that's gonna be really easy to replicate because all we need to do is duplicate this flames layer and remove all the effects. You can do that with Control-Shift-E or Command-Shift-E on a Mac. And I just noticed a typo. Let's fix that, reflection. And we're gonna call this Flames Glow and just scale it up. So I'm gonna grab the scale, I'm gonna really push it up. I need to get rid of this track matte, so I'll take that off. And this is gonna give us our flames footage, which is being blended in with the add blend mode. And I'll just click and drag this up a bit. I don't want it to be too overlapping the logo, but I just wanna blur this out using a fast box blur. And the reason I'm using fast box blur this time is because it's much more sensitive. It goes really quickly. I don't have to crank up the value super high to get a big blur. But I just wanna make this a big blur on my scene and then turn back the opacity. I'll press the T key and dial this way back, turn off my exposure compensation and see what that looks like in the scene. But I just want it to appear like light is coming from the flames onto the background. And if I scrub through here, it is very evident what's happening. I don't want it to really travel so far up the screen. So I might even scale it down vertically so that it's not gonna travel so far up the comp, and instead it's just gonna live closer to the bottom. This is really fine because we're blurring it out so much and dialing back the opacity so far that it's just gonna be a very subtle effect over the entire scene as this little element of atmosphere that again, just helps everything tie together a little bit more. Now, for all these floating ash and ember particles, we're going to be using CC Particle World. They're very, very subtle in this scene. If you don't crank up the exposure, you almost don't see them, but basically every single particle has this glowing ember attached. So we should be able to recreate this really easily using CC Particle World. It's a complicated effect, but if we just dial in the right settings, we can create this atmosphere that works out really well. So let's make a new solid, Command or Control Y, doesn't matter what color, and we'll call this Particles, and go ahead and pre-compose this, Control-Shift-C or Command-Shift-C, and I'll call this Particles as well. Now we can go into that comp and we're going to add the CC Particle World effect. So CC Particle World, apply that effect, and we're going to get a whole bunch of guides and particles just emitting from the center of our comp. I don't need to see any of these grids or guides, so I'm gonna go in here and check all of these off so they're not visible. Again, if you want to learn the ins and outs of this effect, I have an entire tutorial in the Effects of After Effects series. Click the card above if you wanna watch it. It is pretty long because this is a very complicated particle emitter that can do a lot of crazy stuff, but we're gonna dial it in to exactly what we need it to do. First of all, I'm gonna go into the producer and change the radius X to be much wider and the radius Y to be a little bit taller. That way it's not coming from a single point anymore. And then I wanna push the position Y down towards the bottom of the screen. So that way our particles are going to be emitting off screen and we'll be able to see them coming up. Next, let's collapse up producer and go into the physics and change the animation from explosive to fire. These are all different kind of animation patterns. And you can see that this now kind of looks like it's sparks coming off of a fire, which is basically what we're recreating, embers and ash floating in the environment. Now, obviously, I don't want my particles to be flying up like this, so we need to dial back the gravity. In fact, let's just shut it off, and we're left with these particles. They're still moving around too much and twirling. We can dial that back with this extra angle value. I'm gonna turn this down to around 20, and that should give us something that moves a little bit the way that we want it to, but isn't so violent. I could also turn the velocity down, and the issue we're having now is that there's so little velocity and movement to our particles that they're all just staying at the bottom of our comp. So what I wanna do is turn the longevity up to say 10 seconds, and that's gonna have them stick around for much longer, but they now take much longer to fade in because the opacity over time, which we'll get to in a minute, is relative to how long these particles are visible for. So we need to do a couple of things. First of all, let's change the composition settings and make the length of this comp, let's just say 30 seconds. So it's nice and long. I can zoom out on my timeline now with the minus key and extend this layer all the way out so I can go further in time, past when all these particles have been generated and see what they're looking like in a more crowded state. Now they're still disappearing before I want them to, so I might need to increase their longevity so that they fill up the screen a little bit more, but I also see way too many particles, so I'm probably gonna wanna back off the birth rate a little bit. So if I play this now, our particles are moving much slower. There's still probably way more than we need, but they're kind of moving in that very floaty way that I think is gonna work out pretty well. I could probably dial back the velocity even a little bit further, and we'll deal with how low they are in the scene in just a bit. But before we go further, we really should make these particles look the way that we want them to, because they're currently just defaulted to the line type, which is based on how fast they're moving. We don't want that. We want to use a textured disk, which allows us to bring in our own custom particle from any other layer. And to make that particle texture, I'm gonna make a new composition. So I'll go up to Composition, New Composition, and I'll call this one Ember Texture, and change the width and height to be much smaller. We'll just say 50 pixels by 50 pixels. These do not need to be large at all. I'll turn on my transparency grid, and I'm going to draw a custom shape. I'll make it black, and I'll just make this blobby shape. It doesn't have to be very smooth or precise. It just needs to look like a piece of ash that I can make, float in the air. It can have jagged edges, it can have smooth edges, whatever you want it to be. But that should be a good start. I'll call this Ember, and then I'll apply an effect. We'll say Turbulent Displace. And this is normally applied in a much larger comp, so it's going to add a lot of distortion. If I move it around, you can see it's really distorting everything out. I just want to turn the amount down as well as the size. I want the size to be around probably 10 and the amount to be around 30. So somewhere in there, that's gonna give us a much smaller distortion. And then what I wanna do is add a fill effect. So I'll type out fill and make it maybe this really saturated orange color. This is gonna be the ember color of the ash. But to get that black color back on top and only have a portion be this orange, I'm gonna then follow that up with a CC composite effect and uncheck RGB only. And what this is doing is bringing back the original unaffected version of the layer. So just that initial black state before any effects were applied, but we're getting that distorted colored version of the same layer underneath it. So from here, I can go into the turbulent displace and increase the amount or the size, and I can also add in, say, a offset effect, apply that before all the other effects, and then shift this upwards a little bit. If I want it to go up before applying the turbulence, I can do that so that we're only going to get that orange part right on the edge of that layer. And I can play around again with all these settings to come up with something that's just giving me a little bit of that edge for that glowing ember. Now what I can do is animate the evolution of this turbulent displace, and maybe that's way too big. So let me turn the size down pretty far, maybe in around the 5 or 6 point, and then I don't need to offset this quite as much, but maybe the amount could be up and the size could be down. There we go. Now we're getting more of like a texture rather than this huge blobby mess that's coming off. And we'll just shift it up a little bit. And now I can animate that turbulent displace. Again, this is only going to affect the ember, so it's gonna give that part of this layer a little bit of life and difference between the foreground, just black part of the ash. So let's go into the evolution by Alt or Option clicking on the stopwatch, and we'll add an expression. We'll just say time times 100, and that's just going to increase the value over time. If I play this back, you can see that it's not moving all that fast, but it's just gonna give that part of the particle a little bit of life, which I think is a good thing. The next thing we'll do is duplicate that turbulent displace and put it after CC composite, and this is going to add a second level of distortion over the entire thing after all of the effects have been applied. And maybe I'll make the size on this one a little bit bigger and the amount lower. And that way it's going to affect everything in much more of a blobby way. That amount is probably way too much. Let's dial that back. And my goal with this is just to give a little bit of distortion over time as this particle is floating through the air. But another thing that the original particles do, if I go into that original title and find a clear spot and maybe crank the exposure, you'll notice that they are flickering. Just look at one of the particles and play this back in real time, and you see that that orange part is flickering on and off. We can do this again with expressions very simply. I just need to change the way that I'm applying the orange color. So instead of a fill effect, I'm going to bring out a tint effect, because this is going to allow me to fade between the colored state and the uncolored state. So I'm just gonna sample that orange color with the map black to, and then use the same color from map white to. Then I can delete that fill and turn the amount to tint up and down to create this flicker. I don't want to do that manually though. I'm going to do it with an expression. So I'll Alt or Option click on Amount to Tint, and I'll type in a wiggle expression. So wiggle, in between the parentheses, we need a frequency for the first value. So we want this to wiggle probably, let's say 2 times a second to start, and then add a comma and put in the amplitude. So how much is this wiggling per second? Let's say 100%, and we'll just see what happens. Finish that with a semicolon and press the space bar to see how much that flickers. Now this value is relative to whatever it was already set to. So I'm gonna change this from 100 down to 50 so we kind of have a midpoint that it can wiggle around. And that is flickering, but I think it could be going faster. So let's change this from 2 to 3 times per second. That's a little bit more flickery. I think that looks a little better. I might even change 100 to 150 just so it's more of an extreme change and we don't have quite as many of those in-between values. But now that we have this texture, we can apply it to our particles. That was a lot of work to create that particle, but let's actually put it into CC Particle World now. I need to bring that pre-comp into this comp, so I'm going to grab Ember Texture and drag it in, and then let's clean this up again. I'll bring all of these pre-comps into my pre-comp folder, and then I can just actually shut off the visibility. We just need to be able to reference it with CC Particle World. Underneath the texture drop down here, I'll choose the texture layer to be the Ember texture, and right away, we're gonna see that texture show up for all of the particles, and it's kind of hard to see. Let me just go into my composition settings, and I'll change the background color to be like a dark gray instead of black. This isn't actually going to affect the render, it's just our preview for the comp. So what I'm noticing is that all of the particles are playing back at the exact same time, and that obviously doesn't look very good. We can change this by going to the texture time value and changing it from current to birth. And now each particle is going to start the playback of that pre-comp when it was created. And I have more randomization. Well, wait. You know that moment when you're recording a super long in-depth tutorial and you just get in the zone, you say something that you're super confident is totally correct, but is actually completely false? That's what just happened here. That texture time property, I said to change it to birth, but it actually was supposed to be to from start. When you set it to birth, it's just gonna take the first frame of that pre-comp and it's gonna hold onto that frame for the rest of the animation. So none of that flickering that we put all that work into is going to be seen in the particles for the rest of my recording. If you just change it over to from start, it will animate and your project will end up looking better than mine. So just change that property back to from start and we'll be good to go. Now, because we choose texture disk, these particles can rotate. And if I go into the rotation speed, I can change how much they're rotating. So I could turn that rotation speed down. I could also turn the initial rotation down. So if you don't like how much yours are rotating, you can change that. We could also change this to align to direction, and then they're gonna rotate with the direction that they're moving to. I don't think I need that for this simulation, so I'm gonna leave that unchecked. But we obviously need to see more of these particles, and I don't want all this fading in and out. They're also probably way too big. So let's dial in some of these settings a little bit more. First of all, the birth size and death size need to be much smaller. Why don't we say 0.05 for the birth as well as the death size? So they're now much smaller. That might be a little too small. Let's say 0.808, and that will probably work out fine. Max opacity should also be set to 100. I don't want a bunch of semi-transparent particles. And then under the opacity map, we need to make this curve steeper so that they don't take so long to fade into 100%. I'm just gonna click and drag with the pen tool and push it all the way up to there. And then what I can do is hold down the control key and click and drag just a little bit, and that will smooth out my curve. Same thing on this end. I wanna click and drag up and just fill in that whole gap. Control or Command click to smooth that out, and now they're going to fade in and fade out much more sharply. Now, if I go back into my producer, I can lift this up on the position Y. I just don't want to be able to see all these particles fading in constantly. So to get around that, I'm going to set some keyframes for the birth rate. I'll set one at the first frame of the animation, press U to bring up that keyframe, and then convert this to a hold keyframe by pressing Control Alt and clicking on the keyframe. And on Mac, I believe that's Command Option click. Then I'll go forward in time to maybe 5 seconds and turn that down to 0. So the birth rate will be at 0.6 for the start of the animation, and then once it hits that 5-second mark, it's going to stop emitting particles and we're just going to see what has existed so far. So I might need to turn that longevity up to say 30 seconds so that they don't disappear until much further into the comp, and that way I'm left with just kind of this atmosphere of particles, which is exactly what I needed. This is also a really easy way to control how many particles are emitted in the scene if I back this up, because particles are emitting for a shorter amount of time, so there won't be as many further along. The danger is if I push this too far back, then all of the particles are going to be emitted at a very similar time, so their textures are all going to be sampled from a very similar time. So really I do want to keep this around 5 seconds, and instead what I could do to lower the amount of particles is just double click on the first keyframe and maybe cut that in half to say 0.3, and now we'll have fewer particles, but they'll all be randomly sampled from that texture's start time. That looks pretty good. I might just add a little bit of Z depth to space these out a little bit more. And then I want to recreate that camera move using a 3D camera. So we'll come up to Layer, New, Camera. We can leave it as a 1-node camera and we'll say 35mm for the focal length. Click OK, and now I can switch to my camera tool by pressing C and just pan in and out, and we can keyframe this. So let's go to the first frame, press P to bring up the position and set a keyframe there, then go forward in time all the way to say 30 seconds, push forward in the comp, and now we're moving through this field of particles. It's very gradual, but that's okay. Maybe I'll back it up on the first frame a little bit just by clicking and dragging downwards, but now these particles are actually in the atmosphere that we're moving through. Now I'd like to add in some depth of field like we have in the original title. If I again turn on that exposure compensation, we can see that there are particles close to the camera that are out of focus. There are particles that are close to the wall that are nice in focus. I can't actually simulate that using the depth of field tools with 3D cameras in After Effects. CC Particle World does not support that. So instead what I'm going to do is make a few different copies of this layer with particles closer and closer to the camera and blur out each layer. To do that, I'll just duplicate this layer. This will be particles, we'll call this mid, and let's rename the first layer particles wall. But on this mid layer, I'm just gonna go to the producer and back off the position Z. So pull it towards the camera a little bit. And obviously all these particles are in the exact same space. So I wanna go into the extras, find that random seed value and increase it. So it's just a different sampling of particles. For this layer, I'm going to grab the Fastbox Blur effect and we'll just blur out all of our particles. Not a whole lot, but just enough to give a little bit of a sense of depth, so maybe 4 pixels. And then I'll just scrub through this so we can see it. There we go. That definitely does add more depth to the scene. Let's duplicate this layer again and we'll rename this one Foreground. Go into the producer again, pull it back towards the camera even closer, as well as blur it out even further. This one can be a little bit more extreme, but now we're moving through 3 layers of particles that are all progressively more and more blurry, which adds a lot of depth to the scene. So now we need to composite these particles into the main comp. We have those particles here at the top of our comp. Let's give it a different color like yellow, and then I'll move it down below the fade in and out adjustment layer. And I need to make sure to turn off the original title so I can see my own particles. If I solo this layer, they're not very visible, and if you remember, this comp is only about 6 seconds long, but the particles take about 5 seconds to really be filling the screen. So I need to switch to my anchor point tool, which will allow me to shift the contents of this layer in time while keeping the in and out points. So as I drag this over to the left, we're gonna fill the comp with those particles. I just wanna make sure that on the first frame of this comp, they're filling the entire scene. That looks pretty good, so I can unsolo the layer, and now if I go to the 3-second mark where it's brightest, we should be able to see those embers, and if I turn up the exposure compensation, you can see them a lot more clearly. Now, I don't think that we're seeing quite as many particles as there was in the original if I turn that one back on, and it might just be because the ash is black and the embers are really what are being seen in the original. So what I could do is go into my ember texture and maybe change that offset a little bit more, just 1 or 2 more pixels, so we're seeing that offset more prominently in the texture, and that will update through the particle emitter and give us something that is way more apparent. I think that's gonna work better. I'll turn off the exposure compensation to show that it really is subtle. It's in the background, but now we can see that orange part of those embers a little bit more clearly. I'm gonna zoom in here and take a look at one of these embers and let's add a glow to it. So I'll just duplicate the particles layer and I'll call this particles glow and change the blend mode to add. That will make the orange part a little bit brighter. Next, I wanna add a Gaussian blur. And the reason I'm using Gaussian this time is because it's more subtle. It's not as sensitive as Fastbox blur, so I can blur it out just a little bit and then maybe add a levels effect after that to crush the alpha channel and make it just a little bit brighter. So as I bring this up, that's gonna bring that glow to be a little bit brighter. We can see it in the foreground as well. So turning that on and off In fact, let's just turn the whole layer on and off. Now we can really see that glowing ember on those particles, and I think that looks really nice. Let's play through this as a whole to see how everything is working together and if we need to make any other adjustments. All right, very nice. So all these particles are floating in the air. I think it's looking really great. The ember might be just a slightly bit too much visible, so I'm gonna just back that off 1 or 2 pixels. But otherwise, it's working really well. And you can play around with this as much as you want. You can go into the particle emitter, make it thicker or thinner. I could just press U to bring up the keyframes to thicken this up with more particles or back it off a little bit. Again, you don't want to do that too much because that will really line up all the start points of the textures that are being sampled. But overall, I think that's a really great element to add to the entire scene and give it more depth. I want to do just one more thing, which is add an adjustment layer and put that right below, let's say, the fade in and out, and we'll call this layer crunch or punch, whatever you want to label it. And I'm going to add a Gaussian blur, and I'm just going to give this subtlest blur, maybe 2 pixels at the most. That'll soften everything up a little bit, and I'm going to follow that up with an unsharp mask and just increase the amount so that we get rid of that blur basically. But this kind of takes the edge off of that soft artificial vibe and just gives it a little visual crunch. That's what I like to call it. It's just an aesthetic thing that I think really helps, and overall it just gives that little bit of hit to that contrast that makes it feel a little bit more punchy. And here we have our final animation as a whole. From here, you can really do whatever you want to adjust this and make it look however you really want it to be. So let's say you wanted the lighting to be more dramatic. We could go to our base metal material into the CC Blobulize effect and turn down the ambient so that we get much more moody lighting and we're letting the reflections reveal more of the logo. Or if we wanted more rust, we could go into that base metal material, into the rust, and increase the brightness to add more texture and increase the contrast to make it darker, which will completely change the surface quality of that metal. But my favorite part about this is swapping out the source for this entire effect. So if I go into the logo source and change this out from the Cobra Kai logo to something like, I don't know, the Miyagi-Do logo, then we are gonna get a completely procedural effect that updates. And now we see everything that we worked on applied to a completely different alpha channel. Complete with reflections and rust and all of the lighting animations that we've applied. It's extremely easy to change out whatever you want in this source comp now and come up with something completely different. And with that, we have completely recreated the Cobra Kai end title sequence. I hope you got a lot out of this series. Please let me know down in the comments how you liked splitting up this longer tutorial into 3 different videos so that I can know whether or not that's a good idea for the future. Don't forget to tag me at Jake in Motion if you use this for any cool projects and you'd like me to see. I would love to share your work. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.